For most of my life, I didn't decide who I was. Other people did. They decided it casually, in passing comments and quiet judgments, the kind that don't sound cruel until they repeat enough times to become truth. Teachers decided I wasn't exceptional. Relatives decided I was average at best. Friends decided I was the one who followed, not the one who led. And my family? They decided my worth before I was old enough to question it. It wasn't said outright at first. It never is. It came disguised as concern. She's not very ambitious. She's comfortable where she is. She's not built for pressure. Every sentence ended with a smile, as if that made it kind. I learned early that pushing back only made things worse. When I tried to explain myself, people tilted their heads and said, "You're thinking too much." When I dreamed out loud, I was told to be realistic. When I failed once, it was remembered forever. When I succeeded quietly, it was dismissed as luck. So I stopped talking. Not because I had nothing to say, but because no one was listening. At school, I learned how labels stick. Once a teacher decides you're slow, every mistake confirms it. Every hesitation becomes proof. No one notices improvement because improvement doesn't fit the story they've already told themselves. I noticed patterns others ignored. I asked questions that didn't belong on the syllabus. I saw connections that weren't obvious. But those things didn't show up on exams, so they didn't count. My report cards were always the same. Capable, but inconsistent. Needs direction. Lacks confidence. By the time I graduated, the narrative was set. I wasn't the smart one. I wasn't the talented one. I was the safe one. The one people didn't worry about because no one expected much. Family gatherings were the hardest. They weren't openly cruel. That would have been easier. Instead, they were politely dismissive. Conversations happened around me, not with me. Decisions were made without my input, then explained to me later like instructions. When I spoke up, someone always redirected the topic gently, like steering a child away from danger. "Let's hear what others think," they'd say. Others always meant everyone but me. I watched cousins celebrated for small achievements while my bigger efforts passed unnoticed. I watched siblings praised for confidence while my caution was treated as weakness. Over time, I started believing them. That's the quiet damage people don't talk about. When you're told who you are often enough, you stop checking whether it's true. I entered adulthood already shrinking myself. I chose paths that felt acceptable, not exciting. Jobs that paid the bills but didn't challenge me. Roles where being invisible was safer than standing out. And people were comfortable with that. They'd say things like, "She's doing fine. At least she's stable. Not everyone needs to aim high." It sounded supportive, but it was a ceiling. The first crack appeared in an ordinary moment. I was sitting alone one evening, scrolling through my phone, watching people announce promotions, new businesses, milestones. Not with jealousy, just curiosity. I wondered what it would feel like to want more without apologizing for it. That thought scared me. Wanting more felt dangerous, like stepping out of line. But something inside me shifted anyway. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. I started paying attention. To how systems worked. To why certain people succeeded even when they weren't the smartest in the room. To how confidence often mattered more than credentials. I read. A lot. Not books people recommended to sound intelligent, but materials people actually used to make decisions. Reports. Case studies. Conversations hidden in plain sight. For the first time, I wasn't asking for permission to learn. Still, I told no one. Not because I was hiding something, but because I was tired of being corrected. I changed small habits, took risks that didn't look like risks to anyone else. Failed quietly. Adjusted. Tried again. Months passed, then years. On the surface, nothing changed. People still spoke about me the same way. Still made assumptions. Still decided my worth without asking. And I let them. Because something was building underneath their certainty. Something that didn't need their approval. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with fireworks. It came wrapped in disbelief. A conversation I overheard by accident. A decision made about me without me in the room, again. But this time, instead of shrinking, I felt something unfamiliar. Clarity. They weren't wrong about my past. They were wrong about my future. And for the first time, I realized something dangerous and powerful. If they had already decided my worth, then I had nothing left to prove to them. Once that realization settled in, something inside me stopped asking for approval. I didn't become loud. I didn't suddenly announce ambition. I didn't correct anyone when they underestimated me. I simply stopped letting their opinions shape my decisions. That was harder than it sounds. For years, every choice I made ran through an invisible filter. Will this make sense to them? Will this look responsible? Will this be acceptable? Now, for the first time, I started asking a different question. Does this make sense to me? At first, the answers were uncertain. I had spent so long adjusting to expectations that my own instincts felt unreliable. But instincts, like muscles, strengthen when used. I began experimenting quietly. I took on work that scared me a little. Projects where failure wouldn't be public, but growth would be real. I volunteered for responsibilities others avoided, not because they were prestigious, but because they revealed how things actually worked. That's when I noticed something most people missed. Success rarely comes from brilliance alone. It comes from understanding systems. Who decides what matters? Who controls information? Where effort disappears without impact, and where small actions create leverage. I watched people with impressive titles make basic mistakes. I saw confident voices hide uncertainty behind volume. And I realized that what had been labeled as my caution was actually something else entirely. It was observation. Life outside didn't reflect this shift. To everyone else, I was still the same person. At family gatherings, the jokes continued. Not cruel, just dismissive enough to remind me of my place. She's very practical, someone said once, the word practical doing the work of limited. She doesn't need much, another added. I smiled. I always smiled. Not because it didn't sting, but because correcting them felt pointless. When people are comfortable with the version of you they've created, they don't want updates. Updates threaten the story they rely on to understand themselves. I let them keep their story. Behind the scenes, I was building something slowly. Not a single dramatic leap. A series of small, deliberate moves. I learned skills that didn't impress at dinner tables but mattered deeply in real rooms. Negotiation. Risk assessment. Pattern recognition. Decision-making under uncertainty. I failed more than once. Quiet failures. The kind that don't make headlines but teach you exactly where your assumptions are wrong. Each time, I adjusted. Not emotionally, strategically. The work was lonely. There was no applause. No encouragement. No reassurance that I was on the right path. When doubt crept in, there was no one to lean on, because leaning would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant inviting judgment. So I carried it alone. There were moments I almost stopped. Moments when exhaustion made the old voice resurface. Maybe they were right. Maybe this is as far as I go. Maybe wanting more is selfish. Those thoughts were familiar. Comfortable, even. But something had changed. I no longer believed them automatically. Instead, I asked for evidence. And every small win, even unseen, was evidence enough to keep going. Years passed like this. Outwardly ordinary. Internally transformative. People around me advanced, stalled, pivoted, failed. I watched it all with new eyes. Patterns repeated themselves. Overconfidence collapsed. Shortcuts backfired. I stayed steady. And that steadiness compounded. The moment that mattered, the one that changed everything, wasn't when I succeeded. It was when others realized I already had. It happened unexpectedly. A conversation at a gathering I hadn't planned to attend. A name mentioned casually. A role referenced in passing. Someone speaking about me without realizing I was within earshot. They weren't dismissive this time. They were confused. "Wait," someone said. "You didn't know?" That sentence landed differently than any insult ever had. I felt the room shift, not toward me, but away from the assumptions that had defined me for so long. That's when I understood. The story people tell about you only lasts until reality contradicts it. And reality was finally catching up. The moment didn't belong to me. That's the part people always misunderstand. It wasn't something I planned. It wasn't a reveal I staged. It wasn't a speech I prepared. It happened because the world finally collided with the version of me people had been ignoring for years. I was invited to an event I almost didn't attend. One of those professional gatherings where names mattered more than personalities, where conversations revolved around results, numbers, and outcomes. I had been to many like it before, quietly, anonymously, without anyone connecting me to anything significant. That night was different. I arrived late, stayed near the edges, listened more than I spoke. Old habits die slowly. I recognized a few faces from past jobs, from meetings where I'd been present but overlooked. At some point, someone mentioned a project. A familiar one. They spoke about it with admiration, how it had scaled quickly, how it had solved problems others couldn't, how its leadership had made decisions that changed an entire approach. Another person nodded. "Yes, the person behind that is impressive. Very deliberate. Very sharp." They said my name. Casually. Like it was obvious. I watched the reactions ripple through the group. Surprise. Confusion. Disbelief. Someone laughed softly. "Wait, that her?" Another voice followed. I thought. They stopped themselves. Because suddenly, the old assumptions didn't sound safe to say out loud. I didn't step forward. I didn't correct anyone. I let the conversation adjust itself around the truth, awkwardly, slowly. That's how real shifts happen, not with drama, but with recalibration. News travels fast when it doesn't match expectations. Within days, people who hadn't spoken to me in years started reaching out. Some with curiosity. Some with forced warmth. Some pretending nothing had ever been wrong. Family was last. They always are. The call came from my mother. Her voice sounded careful. "We heard something," she said. "About your work." I didn't interrupt. "They said you're involved in something big." "Yes," I replied. There was a pause. "How big?" my father asked in the background. I answered calmly. Factually. Large enough to make them quiet. That silence was heavier than any insult they'd ever thrown my way. The confrontation happened weeks later, at a family gathering that felt eerily familiar. Same house. Same table. Same people. But the energy was different. People looked at me differently, not with admiration exactly, but with uncertainty, the kind that comes when the roles you've assigned someone no longer fit. My parents tried to be gracious. Too gracious. They told stories about me that sounded rewritten. Emphasized traits they had once ignored. Claimed support that had never existed. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. I understood something important in that moment. They weren't lying to deceive me. They were lying to themselves. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that they had been wrong for years. About me. About intelligence. About worth. Later that evening, my father pulled me aside. "You could have told us," he said. I looked at him steadily. "You decided who I was before you ever asked," I replied. "Telling you wouldn't have changed that." He didn't deny it. My mother cried quietly. Not because of what I had achieved, but because of what they had missed. And for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Relief. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. But it became honest. I stopped shrinking my words. Stopped making myself easier to dismiss. Stopped accepting labels that weren't mine. People adjusted, or they didn't. Either way, I moved forward. Sometimes, people ask me what changed. They expect a moment of confidence. A breakthrough decision. A sudden realization of self-worth. I tell them the truth. Nothing about me changed. What changed was the moment I stopped letting other people decide my worth for me. They had years. They used them poorly. And one moment, just one, was enough to undo everything they thought they knew.